Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/Security Week.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the news for the week of February 3rd, 2019. Before we get started, one quick announcement. If you are interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st to the 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code OscarSierra19er-SecWeek for 15% off the main conference or World Pass. So, jumping in for the news for the week of February 3rd, I wanted to quickly just jump to the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability called PrivExchange, which I thought was just like, wow. Well, you know, if you're still hosting your email on premise with Microsoft Exchange, you're going to have a bad time. So, what ended up happening here was there's a 0-day that came out called PrivExchange, found by the folks at, I believe it was ZeroFox, Fox IT. Correction. It's a Dutch cybersecurity firm. And there's 3 vulnerabilities mixed into one. Basically, call the web exchange service using credentials that they can get from there to domain controller because of problems with the exchange server failing to set the sign and seal flags for NTLM. And then boom, on your way to higher privileges inside of the environment. Paul, this is generally just like, bread and butter pen tester stuff. I'm surprised Microsoft didn't catch this.
Yeah, it's very similar to some of the other bugs or inner vulnerabilities. I don't know. It's hard to call them. It's abuses in the way Active Directory works to escalate privileges within the domain. We covered so many of them in 2018, especially. This looks to be some variation of that. In my assessment, we covered it in details last week on Hack Naked News, and that was one of the things I took from it.
Yeah. And in this case, it's just one of those situations where you'd think by now most people would say, okay, cool. Instead of trying to secure this myself on premise, let's just do this in the cloud, which is like you get the rip of the 8-track for a minute or the record, because story number 2 under bugs, breaches, and more is Microsoft Cloud Services see global authentication outage. So, by the way, if you still want to use Microsoft and go to the cloud, last week at least anyway, for a full day, you were having a bad time because Microsoft O365 in Europe was down. Yeah, I don't know, Paul. It's like you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? You go to the cloud, you get a more secure ecosystem, but you're now totally reliant on the ecosystem. And if it's not, if it doesn't have the right uptime, you're kind of doomed.
Yeah, I still think that for so many organizations, the level of uptime in cloud-based services is still better than that which you could provide on your own.
Oh, 100%.
That's not true there are some organizations that are very hyper-focused on, reliability and uptime for their specific services, have a large enough team with a large enough budget that, yes, they could very well do that, and they should. But for most of us, the cloud, even though cloud providers have outages every once in a while, I don't think that's a need to leave cloud services altogether.
Got it. And I agree with you. I mean, to some degree, it's a situation where, like, I don't know, are you a sysadmin? Are you interested in being sysadmins?
Right.
Or would you rather just have it be served up to you, which is probably more secure, probably has better uptime? And if you had the same sort of outage internally, would you be able to get it back up in a single day like Microsoft can? Because for most customers anyway, not all of them certainly, but for about, I'd say, 99% of the customers, you're probably smaller than someone else who is much larger and is also using the service. So that much larger, like 800-pound gorilla in the room is already beating Microsoft or Google or whoever else is the provider over the head to make sure that they get it fixed in a timely fashion, right? So
yep.
To that degree, I think that you gain a lot of leverage by using a cloud service, not just for the fact that they already have the people on staff to deal with the problems for you, but also it's almost like a crowd mentality now, where you're part of a crowd of customers that are going to be going after Microsoft, going after Amazon or Google or whoever, to either claw back some of the budget that they've now paid them for the service, or get credits, or making sure that they bring it back up fast enough that that meets SLAs for a number of customers, right? So I don't know. Make sure you work with your legal team to write in some sort of agreements to allow you to properly get financially made whole in the event of a situation where you lose an outage and it causes some sort of business you know negative impacts of some kind. Say you lose a deal for some reason or another, right? But again, I thought that was interesting, and I just wanted to quickly highlight it. Now, I did want to jump, Paul, to story number 2 under "If you build it, they will come," mostly because this was an interesting story about how Safari engineers, so the folks that are writing the Safari application for Mac OS or iOS, are looking at limiting the amount of JavaScript that a website can load as a counteracting point to advertisements and tracking and things of that nature that get loaded in as part of JavaScript on websites. I thought this was kind of a neat idea. I mean, to some degree, you can reasonably expect the size of a website's JavaScript to meet certain parameters. And then after that, you say, you know what? Nah, we're not going to serve up the rest of this stuff because it's probably garbage. What are your thoughts, Paul?
I think this is a really bad idea and a bad approach. I mean,
Okay.
to me, the amount of JavaScript on, which is essentially what they're measuring, right, is how much JavaScript. First of all, that's a hard thing to measure, right? Because JavaScript is oftentimes compressed or obfuscated and or both, right? So the
Yep.
work, eventually in the browser, is that true? Is it always deobfuscated once it's interpreted by the browser? Or
It's still, I mean,
eh,
obfuscated. It's still pretty much obfuscated, right? It's minified, and it's a situation where now you
right.
you still can't know what the name of the function is, or the variables that are being passed around and what they're intended to be used for.
Yeah, so I think just, how much JavaScript is a bad measure. Even if you came up with some smart ways of measuring it, it's not really indicative of whether it's malicious or not. It's really just a size calculation, which that just has me confused, and therefore I think it's a pretty terrible idea.
Well, I mean, and not to mention the fact that most websites today are written almost wholesale with JavaScript, right? It's either React or
Yeah,
Angular or Vue or something else.
exactly.
Now, now, what I would like to see, maybe, and I think it could reasonably work. I mean, there's always going to be a cat and mouse game here, but if you were to do it based on like a standard deviation of size, right? So if 90% of your JavaScript is within like half a standard deviation of a specific size, and then anything that falls outside of that standard deviation, especially on the upper end or the upper limit scale, ends up being chopped off, right? So, hey, that's a really hefty advertising tracking package, and it's 2 standard deviations away from the rest of the packages that are being loaded into this application. So don't load it.
Yeah, I agree. If you couple that with some other measurements and telemetry, it could be a good kind of data point to determine if something is advertising related or malicious. But again, the whole thing with ads in the web has been totally flipped on its head.
Oh yeah, and it's a problem that I think we're going to continue to face, right? Like per our previous segment, it's a situation of, as we talked about last week, Chrome is looking to do away with features and functionality that effectively allow for ad blocking to exist in the Chrome ecosystem, which is like 90% of the traffic on the web runs through Chrome.
Hmm.
Um, but the problem ends up being that ads slow down your web experience, and ads, at least in some cases, serve malicious content, right? So and by the way, who relies on ads to make the majority of their revenue? Facebook and Google.
Hmm.
So I don't know that they have a vested interest in necessarily removing ads from the web that are necessarily malicious, or to do the right thing and cut off the tracking mechanisms that they're putting forward. So I don't know. It's an interesting spin on the problem space. Now, Safari in general has always been a little bit forward leaning in trying to get rid of what are otherwise potentially negative software implications. So, really good example: Adobe Flash, right? Doesn't work on Safari. Um, So I don't know. I like to see maybe where they're going. One thing that I think would maybe be an interesting thing to see out of the Safari team is like Flash, if they were to go to the way of WebAssembly, and looking at WebAssembly is kind of the next leading language to speed up the experience of web applications, and then drop JavaScript wholesale. That would be like probably we're probably a few, at least 3, 4, maybe 7 years out from that actually happening. But at some point, I get the feeling that we'll see Safari drops JavaScript wholesale because it becomes just such a negative ecosystem of advertisements and tracking mechanisms, and basically Go, in my opinion anyway, Go will probably become the language of WebAssembly in the future for a lot of web design, coming up here in the next few years, as that sort of comes about. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. I like that they're at least looking at the problem and trying to solve it, as opposed to the Googles of the world who are saying, we don't really like the fact that you can actually rewrite the actual addressing and the headers and things of that nature with your ad blocking technology. So we're just going to get rid of it. So, so I did want to jump to one other story that I thought was interesting, and it had a lot of metrics and data. Although, Paul, I'm sure that you will rip it up. It's story number 3 under "If you build it, they will come." It's on bounties and boffins. It's from the Trail of Bits blog. And what they did is they looked at public bug bounty programs available for HackerOne, Facebook, Twitter, Square, Slack, Coinbase, and Flash. And then they went and did the kind of the data analysis on whether or not it was worth it for you to actually go ahead and do bug bounties. And actually, I should say they did not. It was the New Solutions for Cybersecurity by MIT Press. So it was the labor market for bugs. Is the specific article, and then this blog is a reflection on that and pulling out some of the data. And I don't know, their findings look pretty accurate from everything I can tell based on marketing and other media that comes out of HackerOne and other bug bounty platforms, which is to say that really only the top 1% of hackers on any given platform end up consuming something like, I don't know, 70 to 90% of the actual bounties that get paid, which doesn't bode very well for anyone else that's like, hey, bug bounty programs are the solution of the future.
Well, and I think that statistic is really compelling for me. If I'm a company and I want to go get a bug bounty, you got to understand that your experience is going to be much better if those more experienced bug bounty hunters are paying attention to your bounties, right? That right. Seems to be a little game that's in there. I know there's arguments on both sides, Keith. As you know, I mean, you used to work for a bug bounty company, right? I can see both sides of the argument. This article is definitely presenting it in the bug bounties are a waste of time, complete waste of time. I wouldn't say they're complete, right? But you got to know some things going into it, as you very well know, Keith, and a lot of our listeners do too, right? You got to know the things going in, and some of those things are, the smaller percentage of the bug bounty hunters are finding the majority of the bugs. So, provided your program structured correctly, they probably will look at your bugs. But yeah, in any case.
Yeah, it's a situation where, and yes, full disclosure, I used to work at BugCrowd, a bug bounty platform provider. But it's one of those situations where it's really gamified, right? And at some point, the cost benefit analysis doesn't work if you're a company, right? If you have, by the way, the top 1% or 6 participants, specifically on HackerOne, looking at your program, okay, maybe you're in a good spot, right? But that's 6 people on their crowd of supposedly 300,000 people. But those top 1% had landed 161 bugs across kind of the platform, as the data shows. And then the top 1% of participants on the Facebook bug bounty program collected something like 274 bugs. So it shows like the averages are between 27 and 39 bugs per person, respectively. But if you actually monetize out the number of bugs per month and the findings of those bugs per each bug bounty hunter, the top 1% of earnings is somewhere in the range of $35K per year, which that's not the way that any of the bug bounty platforms seem to be, marketing. Hey, become a bug bounty hunter and moonlight and do this sort of thing, and you'll make oodles of money. It's like, yeah, like I understand that maybe that's happening,
Mm.
especially for some of like the event-based bug bounty things that they do. So there was like the Hack the Pentagon event that they had like the in-person hackers there. And then I think there've been a couple of others put on by other providers as well. And it's a situation where it's like, okay, sure, maybe like some of the really top bug bounty people are getting crazy amounts of money. But if I'm a company, I don't want to spend $100,000 for one person to find, I don't know, say like 10 bugs,
Mm.
when I could spend half that and find a whole lot more bugs from a pen testing firm to come in and do that for me over a longer period of time. I don't know that anyone needs to know that many bugs in like a single day, right? Can you
Yeah,
even
it's
fix
true.
that many bugs in a single day?
Right. Right.
So yeah, it's a good article. It does the math and it breaks it down pretty well. Now, granted, they do not have perfect insight, right? Like there are a lot of programs that run privately
Sure.
on bug bounty platforms, which they just do not have the data from, and I would imagine have probably better payment metrics than what they're seeing on the public programs.
Right.
Um, Even still, again, it's a situation of based at least on the public data that they're showing, you need to gamify the way that you keep people's attention. And if you don't keep the top hunters' attention, you don't get as good of bugs or you don't get bugs at all. Uh, at the end of the day, then you may end up spending more to keep their attention than you would get from a private firm doing it for, say, 2 weeks. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
cost benefit analysis.
yeah, and again, you got to know what all the variables are, right? In the decisions that do I hire a pen test company? Do I hire someone internally? Do I have a public bug bounty? Do I have a private bug bounty? Or what combination of those things do I want to have, kind of as part of my security program at many different levels? And I think that's the way you have to look at it. You can't just look at it like, oh, we're just going to have a bug bounty, right? And we're going to throw it out there for a bunch of people. There's a lot of careful thought and planning that has to go into it. And hopefully those that have the public bug bounties, that usually the ones coming under scrutiny, are benefiting from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was another article, and I'll probably include it next week, from one of those top bug bounty hunters that basically said, hey, a lot of you guys are getting screwed because they do have private programs that are paying good cash, and they
Sure.
have public programs that are doing kudos only, and you're getting totally screwed. And that's very true. I see a lot of companies that seem to be doing that, or at least it looks like they could be doing that based on some of the data that's been brought forth in this article. So yeah, needless to say, we'll cover that one next week. But it's kind of an ongoing situation of bug bounties, is kind of sexy as they might be, probably aren't going to be your sole solution. They're going to be a small portion to the total solutions that you're going to look at.
Hmm.
As I've said here, I think a few times on the show. So I also wanted to cover story number one under bugs, breaches, and more, because I thought it was interesting. So the headline is a bit confusing, I will admit. It says 3 UK customers, details exposed in homepage blunder. And you're like, so what? It's 3 people. Who cares? And then I realized that 3 UK is actually like a mobile provider.
Ah,
Uh, so, so that's why I was like, oh, all right, this actually kind of matters. And at 3 UK, actually, not a mobile provider per se, but it looks like it might be like an ISP of some kind. And so, what ended up happening though was someone, like a user, went to their page on their mobile internet connection, and supposedly it automatically recognizes you when you log in, or and logs you in that way. Now, if you're doing that from your home Wi-Fi, which in this case wasn't a provider, wasn't 3, the company provider, it would actually show you after like automatically logging you in someone else's details. So I just like, I can't even with this, Paul. You're automatically logging people in based on some obscure metadata that you're grabbing, which, by the way, can probably be spoofed with a great deal of accuracy. Say you're just doing, I don't know, IP spoofing, for example. But it was then giving you back fairly, detailed levels of data on individuals, not quite their credit card information, but you'd get their name, you'd get their address, you'd get their account number, you'd get kind of their billing cycle, their email. This is not great, especially with GDPR in effect.
yeah. I don't want to pick on the UK certainly, but I remember years ago they were talking about the BT Home Hub. Remember those?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
It seems to be like a similar thing. And I don't think this type of thing, I'll just put it out, it's not specific to the UK, right? But we've seen problems like this with ISPs, both from the cellular provider and from your regular internet providers that, accessing the maintenance or accessing the administrative pages and protecting your Wi-Fi networks just like goes out the window. For usability purposes, essentially, both from the user consumer perspective and from the administrative perspective of the provider trying to administer their gear. And unfortunately, it's just a really common security blunder that's made. And for whatever reason, reminded me of that horrible BT Home Hub. They were trying to like put the VoIP, there was like a VoIP thing with it. It was horrible.
And it's like, I don't know if they're failing on authorization or authentication or both here, right? Like it's a situation of, okay, you're grabbing metadata to auto log them in, and then you're showing them a whole series of things that maybe they shouldn't be able to see based on your auto login functionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, yes, there's probably some things you could do from an auto login functionality that may seem reasonable without giving away, the farm per se. But I don't know. Like this was just one of those things where I don't even know what they were thinking, right? Like auto log in without even requiring, I don't know, a password or someone to enter like some meaningful piece of data or series of items that could corroborate the metadata that you're gathering. It's just they totally failed on all of that front. Apparently, they did take their website down for a period of time to show that it was going under construction for a revamp, and then brought it back online. But they say they only know of 4 people who had complained about being able to view this information at random. And it's like, yeah, of course, there are only 4 people that are complaining about it. That doesn't mean that the criminals that have now, scraped all of your data via scripting this are going to complain to you, because I guarantee you they're not. So yeah, that was just a thing. So real quick, I did want to cover a couple learning and tools, and there was one food for thought article that I thought was interesting. So to add to your book list, Paul, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is a book that I actually just picked up the last few days. I've only read, I don't know, a portion of the first chapter, but to use a kind of modern term us millennials like to use, I was shook. I read the first few pages and I was just totally taken in by this book. So I imagine next week we'll talk about it a lot more and a lot of kind of the future state as we're headed toward in terms of privacy and software development. But man, this book is good, and it's number 1 under learning and tools for those of you that want to pick up a new book and read something. So there's one for you, Paul. The other one that I thought was an interesting article as well was The Life of a GitHub Action. So this is by Jesse Frizzell. So Jesse used to work at GitHub, has since departed for what seemed like a very short stint there. But GitHub Actions are kind of interesting because they're sort of like, continuous integration tooling, and they're also sort of like continuous delivery, but they're more like if this then that meets code. And this was cool. So it's just a number 2 under if you build it, or excuse me, under learning and tools. We covered Jerry Gamblin's one for this with dependency check last week. So that was another one as well for those people that were like, hey, so you've got these GitHub Actions, and I understand that you can do dependency check with them, but what the heck is a GitHub Action? So this was kind of the response to that I wanted to make sure people had a chance to go and read because I thought it would be valuable to our listeners. The last article, though, Paul, because I know we're coming close to time here, that I wanted to talk about was story number 1 under food for thought, which is security isn't enough. Silicon Valley needs abusability testing from Wired. And I think this goes to the heart of today's discussion, which is while we can perhaps even secure the data that is being gathered by, say, people like Facebook, if the mechanisms that AI are generating can be abused in some way to, I don't know, throw an election or even, cause riots, for example, in different areas of the world, that we should maybe start to think about that as the next level of security that we need to start considering, which is the second order problems that just because we can doesn't mean we should. Did you get a chance to grab any of the highlights off of this, Paul? I know that this was a pretty good article, and it did have a number of quotes from the former FTC chairman, Ashkan Soltani.
Sorry, which one was this?
Story number 1 under food for thought. Security isn't enough.
Yeah, I did not read this one.
It's okay.
But I will.
So to quote Ashkan, so he says, we need to try to think about the ways things can go wrong, not just in the ways that harm us as a company, but in the ways that harm those using our platform and other groups and society. Which I think, as a summary point for that entire article is spot on, right? So
yeah, we talked about that in the beginning of the show, actually.
Right, exactly. And it's interesting because in the same way that they talk about this, while not an abuse scenario, but I've also recently started thinking about the InfoSec Mentors project and the way that it's currently set up and the way that it probably should be set up that is different. So we'll use that as a thought experiment for the discussion of this article because I think it's worth talking about, which is I'm working on / considering giving a talk on the topic of don't get a mentor. Now, ironically, a lot of us all say, you should get a mentor in the industry. And I'm the person who wrote the InfoSec Mentors Project website and code and, co-founded that with Jimmy Vo. So for me to say don't get a mentor is kind of ironic. But the way that it's set up today is intended for you to kind of advertise your availability and your skill sets and then to connect with people. And I think that if I had a default state for a person to say, a specific time of day that they're willing to sit down and be available for like office hours, and you could go and ask questions as opposed to, mentor me, give me all of your guru knowledge. That's better than getting a mentor. And there's a friend of mine whose name is Andrew, who recently graduated college with an economics degree and kind of hates it and kind of hates his job. And one of the things he's done, and I think that this is kind of the impetus for me starting this talk and thinking about this problem space, is he asks me a series of questions for guidance and feedback. And sure, it started a little bit more generally of what could I reasonably get into in tech that I could find a decent job and pay me well in a shorter period of time. And I said, web development. It pays fairly well compared to what he's making now. And it doesn't take a whole lot to learn. And it's all, the resources are pretty freely available to learn from. So he started on web development. And then a couple months later, he comes back and says, hey, I've learned, HTML, CSS, and a bunch of JavaScript. Should I use Angular or React? Why or why not? So I gave him that, suggestion there. Comes back a couple months after that and says, hey, cool, I've learned more Angular or React. What else should I get into? Data, or should I do anything with databases, or should I look on the server side? And that mentorship relationship has taken me, like, in the sum of the text message discussions we've had, probably like 2 hours. And it's gone over the course of 6 or 7 months now. And he's learned a ton. And now he's doing some freelance work to go and kind of, to build a profile or a portfolio of things that he has done so that he can show, prospective customers or employers of the things he's capable of. And I think in the same way that we think about the implications of the way that we write our software, especially around privacy, can follow suit in the same way, right? The default state, or the way that you build the application, will have implications for the downstream activity of your user base. And if you consciously consider all the potential abusability cases, maybe you can write the software in a way that, I don't know, prevents, or at least will divert those abusability cases into sinkholes of some variety. So yeah, this was a great article. I highly encourage anyone to go and read it. It was on Wired Magazine. Again, it's Security Isn't Enough. Silicon Valley Needs Abusability Testing. And it's just really good. Lots of highlights in there, including, of course, toward the end of it, Soltani says, we can use art to think about the potential dystopias we want to avoid. And he goes on to state, I think Black Mirror has done more to inform people on the potential pitfalls of AI than any White House policy paper. Yeah. Which I thought was poignant.
Accurate.
So with that, I do want to just point out our commit strip comic for the week that we're highlighting, which is Git large file sharing, or Git LFS. It's a rather funny sysadmin meets developer use case of Git LFS. I think our readers will enjoy it. In the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.